thank you very much, Aline, and thanks also for having me to the organizers. I hope you can see my chart. Is it already on?
Yes, we can see it well.
Thank you very much. Okay, so actually my talk is quite compatible with what Richard just talked about. Basically, I would like to talk about the connection of mini-lateralism that we watch on the global scene, but also particularly in the Indo-Pacific in recent years, and populism. And when you look at the discussion of mini-lateralism, I'll explain that term soon, small groups of countries, then you realize it's usually done from an international relations perspective. And actually, that's also where I come from. I'm an economist, an institutional economist, interested in the international relations in the region of Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific, East Asia. And I was wondering that there is rather little talk about the domestic political background of this development. And now, obviously, Richard Clarke does not belong there. He discusses this domestic political background, and there are certainly a couple of others. But I think it's still a little bit under-researched. So my question is, can we relate populism as a driver for the development of increasing mini-lateralism in the region? What can we expect from if there is this kind of connection, and what about the empirical evidence? Now, to do that, I have to deal with two concepts, with mini-lateralism and with populism. And I start with the first. I start with mini-lateralism. Well, it's about a small number of countries associating themselves with each other. So it's not like multilateralism, all or almost all, like in WTO or IMF. It's a small number of countries. And the famous definition speaks of the smallest possible number of countries needed to have the largest possible impact on solving a particular problem. So you see, there's already a kind of efficiency argument in that, because it's usually not very easy to define what is the smallest number necessary to solve a problem. There is the expectation that mini-lateralism offers this kind of effectiveness and efficiency gains. Now, why would that be so with a small number of countries? Well, an important argument is that you have like-minded countries finding some scope for working together, that there is some informality in that, which makes it easier to solve questions against these behemoths like IMF. Well, some of these groups may be regional, some may be not. But usually, as a small number of countries, they often also have a rather targeted purpose in the area of trade, but not trying to be a substitute for something like the WTO, but taking a specific idea. Also in the area of infrastructure, security, international security, environment, and so on. So this is what we are talking about. Here are some examples also why to show that this is really an important development in the Indo-Pacific. And you see the years 2017, 2015, 2016 show that this is a fairly recent development. So maybe the most famous one is the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue between Australia, India, Japan, and the US. To some extent, definitely geared against China, but at least normally it's about the open seas, the rule of law, and freedom, and different concepts. We have AUKUS, a similar grouping without participation of India in military cooperation. You know, maybe the most famous aspect is that Australia now purchases nuclear-powered submarines from the United States. That's under the AUKUS agreement. Australia, Japan, India, trilateral cooperation in a different field, supply chain resilience. You see, that's the area of trade, but it's a special, focused part of the trade agenda. Then there's something that China, just another example, there are so many, but to show that it's not only the democratic countries involved, a Southeast Asian cooperation scheme, LMC, between China and regional countries. And there are also groups going beyond regional borders. For instance, there's something called MICTA, which includes the non-G7 and non-BRICS members of G20, and actually also involves a majority of countries in the Indo-Pacific region. So this is what we're talking about. Sorry, yeah. So why would we have this kind of mini-lateral push? I mean, the usual argument is that we find the deficiencies of multilateralism that also Richard talked about a little bit. It's their formality, which leads to clumsiness. It's also countries trying to get away with skirting, trying to undermine the formal rule mechanisms they originally agreed to. It's also the difficulty to reform them. There are also difficulties of another extreme if you try to handle something through bilateralism. Take the example of trade. If WTO doesn't work, you might enter into a bilateral trade agreement. But that is often suboptimal. It's a complex, sometimes called spaghetti bowl of bilateral agreements. It's very complex, so it also has deficiencies. The same holds for plurilateralism, so having many countries together. So if you do this by negation, you end up with considering mini-lateralism. And as I already tried to show, yes, it's recommended on the basis of effectiveness and efficiency considerations. The informality can speed up things, it may be flexible, it's modular, you can experiment, try something else. It may also have, it was suggested in the literature, to have lower transaction costs these days with easier communication. Well, I'm not so sure about that. If you ask people in the foreign offices, I mean, they are overwhelmed with these kind of agreements. So maybe not, but anyway, it's an efficiency argument. There are also some downsides of mini-laterals. They might undermine multilateral mechanisms, obviously. I don't go into the detail. Forum shopping, that was also mentioned by Richard. There is the intransparency, lack of accounting. You don't even really find out often what has been agreed or what is being discussed. They are considered sometimes toothless. And it's also a problem if they are dominated by one of the partners, because it means that you won't necessarily have really a fair association. So we have pros and cons, and it's very difficult from that perspective to evaluate them. Are there meaningful alternatives or not? And the argument would be that it certainly also depends on the political processes behind it. Who is actually driving for mini-laterals and for what purpose? And that leads me to consider, well, is it populist governments that have a rather strong interest in them? Because, I mean, there is this, at least this conspicuous similarity of the time, right? Populism rising and mini-laterals rising at the same time. Now, I mean, I have the problem when I'm talking about countries in the Indo-Pacific, or it may be similar in other regions to say, what is actually a populist government or what is a populist party? And we know there are different understandings, populism as an ideology, as a strategy, as a communication style, or what economists would usually prefer, you know, looking at the policies with right-wing policies like nationalism, anti-tax stance, or left-wing populism, focus on governance spending and so on. So please keep that in mind because I need this for the empirical evidence later on. Now, to draw a connection between populism and mini-lateralism, I need to discuss why populism comes about. Is it related to something going on in the economic sphere of international relation? And of course, that is a rather naive question, because we probably all know that, yes, there is a connection. There is the economic globalization with rising inequalities, which existing multilateral schemes seem have difficulties to handle. Not only inequalities, but inequalities concentrated with respect to certain characteristics like low-skilled workers, certain regions, and so on, making things even tougher. We have the crisis that were also mentioned in a question we just had. We had migration, refugees that are also related to this. And we see that the multilateral schemes do not really work very well. So there seems to be and there may be now a certain tension with what Richard just said, but I would put it like that. There is this dissatisfaction with multilateral schemes, and for populists, the need or the hope to find something else which they can present as an easy solution, or what was it, a jaka that was mentioned in the beginning. So do populists as political entrepreneurs really move along these lines? Yes, I mean, they suggest protectionism, they suggest to strictly regulate migration, they turn against multilateral organizations, at least verbally, whether they still participate or not. And they argue in favor of minilateral agreements. Because focusing on certain areas gives them a chance to avoid rather unpleasant issues they would have to face in existing multilateral mechanisms, for instance. They avoid formal binding agreements, which is tough if you have to abide to an agreement which in a certain case works against your own interests. At the same time, they show some activism. They do something. Well, you know, in this informal agreement, the downside risks for this political entrepreneur are rather small, and they diminish the gaps created by the rejections of the multilateral level. So yes, minilateralism is in the interest of populists. So finally, what about the empirical evidence? And well, my field of interest is the Indo-Pacific region, and there are two drivers that have been following minilateral schemes, and I want to discuss those two. The first is the United States, and the second is Japan. And I think they are responsible for most of what has been going on in terms of minilateral agreements, and others rather react to that. So I would also suggest that the Lakang-Mekong agreement is rather, a reaction to what has been going on elsewhere. So let's first turn to the US. Well, I don't think there's any doubt that a Trump administration can be considered populistic under all four definitions I have mentioned before. And yes, indeed, we find that the US has been a strong mover, particularly in terms of finding a minilateral response to what has going on, simply described as the rise of China. And AUKUS and Quad that I mentioned before are probably the most conspicuous attempts to find like-minded partners in the region. Yes, they were started under the Trump administration. So, I mean, this almost perfectly fits the argument. It is related to a rejection of multilateral mechanisms. If you look at some of the documents, I mean, it's clearly argued that existing multilateral schemes or what has been beginning called maybe the international rule of law that does not work properly. There has also been the expectation that the US would be the dominant political partner in this. And there was also the need to find like-minded countries. So we can, I think, easily conclude that the populistic US, in effect, became a leader of mini-lateralism in the Indo-Pacific. Now, the second case of Japan is a little bit more problematic. Because the first question is Japan a populistic country or not? Now, if you have followed the very interesting presentation of Professor Axel Klein last year at the first symposium, he actually spoke about this issue, is Japan a populist country? And he concluded that based on the on ideology, so on ideas, or also on strategy aspects, I think you know these two theoretical lines, so I don't go into details. Japan cannot actually be considered populistic. Well, I would disagree a little bit with that based on at least the definitions 3 and 4. And 3 was about the communication style. And if we look at Prime Minister Koizumi in the 2000s and later Prime Minister Abe in the 10th, then their style of approaching the public, Koizumi as the lion and so on, definitely points to a populist style. Fourth, the policies. Let me just speak about Abe because it's more recent. Probably we all remember the expansionist Abenomics concept of creating more and more money, which has been criticized by conventional economists. So I think it's a typical populist policy to try to find an easy solution, which eventually didn't work. It's the nationalism, Abe trying to change the constitution. And it's also, at least let's call it the sentiment against migration. So I would argue that, yes, Japan also has been pretty much a populist government in the years that are interesting for us. Do they follow populistic policies in international relations? Well, to some extent. Protectionism, no. Against multinational multilateral organizations, no. But against migration, yes. And definitely also following the idea of mini-laterals. So, I mean, it's not a simple answer, but I think we might want to argue that Japan is not protectionist and against multilateral organization, because actually the downside of the globalization effect in terms of distributional problems has not been that tough for Japan. Still, there are other issues. For instance, finding something against the Chinese rise. And we might even say that in that respect, Japan has been even an earlier proposer of mini-lateral schemes in the region than the US. Let me just remind you of a famous speech by Abe before the Indian Parliament in 2007, in which he proposed something like the Quad. Well, at this stage, let me reach my conclusion. So in order to have some time for the discussion. What I hope, I think what is obvious is that we see the co-evolution of mini-lateralism and populism, which is striking. I mean, I realize there are difficulties to clearly define what is a minilateral agreement, also what is populism. For instance, I noticed the chart that Richard Clark just presented in the case of Japan is both different from what Axel Klein said last year, and it's different from what I said right now. So it's not so easy to work on this in a quantitative manner. But anyway, I think we have this co-evolution. And I think I could also show that it is related, the rise of minilateralism related to domestic political effects, and that it is something that populists would try to propose if they are strong enough to propose a minilateral scale. Not all countries can do that for certain reasons as an entrepreneur. Finally, what does this lead to? And here I'm most speculative, and this is just conjecture. Because as I argued in the beginning, well, it's not quite clear whether the pro or the cons effects of minilateralism are more striking. Now, if indeed populism plays a role to bring it about, then one should be a little bit probably not pessimistic or not too easily buy the arguments that minilaterals are particularly effective. But that is just a conjecture open to further investigation. Thank you very much.